Natural disaster and climate change continue to displace people across the Asia and Pacific region, resulting in significant impacts on their human rights. How do we ensure that people's basic rights, such as life, health, and education, can be fulfilled after a disaster or climate change event? How do we support the rights of people who are on the move after disaster? And how do we guarantee the human rights of those who live in new and foreign places? We can engage and empower communities to develop their own disaster risk reduction strategies. We can ensure disaster management stakeholders better understand human rights approaches in relation to disaster and climate change. And we can strengthen networking and knowledge sharing using practical tools, applying research outcomes, and providing training to support human rights efforts in disaster management. This ensures that the human rights of displaced people are always considered within disaster risk reduction and climate change activities.
Good afternoon again, everyone. On behalf of Raoul Wallenberg Institute, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you who sacrifice your precious time joining us today. We hope you will find this launch of our thematic research on displacement in the context of disaster and climate change fruitful and engaging. But first of this afternoon session, I would like to invite Dr. Iren Singh. Dr. Iren Singh is the Senior Research Advisor at the Section for Regional Development Cooperation for Asia and the Pacific at the Embassy of Sweden in Bangkok. He currently manages Sweden's regional research cooperation in Asia, together with regional programs related to disaster risk reduction, environment, and climate change. Dr. Iren will be opening this event with his welcoming remarks. Please welcome. ขอเสียงปรบมือด้วยครับ Please give a round of applause for him, please. Thank you. You can use my microphone.
Great, thank you very much. Distinguished participants, and a very good afternoon to you all, everyone in the room here today and online. Okay. It's a pleasure to join you here today and offer some brief welcoming remarks on displacement in the context of disasters and climate change in Asia and the Pacific. I would like to thank the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law and the Stockholm Environment Institute for the opportunity to be here and for inviting me. Sweden, like you and your organizations, is committed to strengthening our collective ability to prepare for and to bolster resilience to disasters. Like you, we want to take actions that will benefit all members of society. The Swedish government is a feminist government, and Sweden has a feminist foreign policy. Our feminist foreign policy prioritizes respect for human rights, representation in decision-making, and equal rights to available resources. Sweden's regional development cooperation in Asia and the Pacific is carried out by our embassy in Bangkok. Our goal is to contribute to an inclusive, sustainable development in the region whereby people living in poverty and under oppression can improve their lives. Our approach to development cooperation is to support regional actors that address transboundary challenges and opportunities. We work with partners whose activities integrate human rights, democracy, and gender, together with environmental conservation and climate change adaptation and mitigation. While it's difficult to predict exactly where and when a disaster will take place, we do know that they will continue to impact us for the foreseeable future. We understand that patterns of disaster are changing due to climate change and unsustainable development pathways. Furthermore, it's clear that persons living in poverty and persons that do not enjoy their full range of human rights are the ones that are most vulnerable to the consequences of disaster. So we're not helpless in these challenges. Our shared knowledge, our commitment, and our combined creativity and ingenuity, these are our strengths. We can work together to make choices that mitigate the risks, that reduce impacts, and improve capacity to rebound from disaster. The Embassy is happy to support the Raoul Wallenberg Institute's Regional Asia Pacific Program and the Stockholm Environment Institute as they mainstream human rights and gender-based approaches for understanding and addressing displacement in the context of disasters and climate change. In the Asia Pacific region, we're also partnered with ADPC, UNEP, UN Women, and the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency to support their important work in the field of disaster risk reduction. RWNI and SEI have brought us here today to participate in discussion of how human rights-based approaches can make us more effective in our collective work to prevent, prepare for, protect during, and respond after displacement and disaster. I look very much forward to learning more from Dr. Matthew Scott and Dr. Albert Salamanca about the findings of the 10-country Pacific study on rights-based approaches to displacements. Furthermore, I'm especially keen to benefit from the discussions that follow on how the research is and can be put into use to make a difference. Once more, thank you to SEI and RWI for the invitation to deliver these remarks, and I look forward to a rich and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Uren, for very insightful remarks and your carings for the world and society. And next, I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Morten Charam, Raoul Wallenberg Institute Director, who will speak from Lund, Sweden.
Good afternoon and good morning. Good to see you all. I would have wished I could have been with you in a fantastic Bangkok, but this is then the second best way. But it's a great pleasure for me as well to be here at the opening of this the launch of the thematic study on displacement in the context of disasters and climate change in Asia and the Pacific. It's great to see so many present in Bangkok as well as online for this launch. I must say, as director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, I'm very proud to present the studies and what we're here to discuss, because I think it shows the best of what the Raoul Wallenberg Institute on human rights and humanitarian law is mandated to do, namely research, education, and not least the direct engagement with those who actually have the possibility to make a change on those issues that are raised in these reports and other studies that we do. And this is all done in a global network across the 8 offices of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. I'm here in Lund, and then we have Nairobi, Amman, Jakarta, Phnom Penh, just to mention a few. I'm also very happy with this particular study because since the Raoul Wallenberg started 35, 36 years ago, the issue of displaced persons, both internal displaced and refugees, people crossing a border, has been with the Institute. It has always gone through our, passed through our work. But despite the long history of having worked in this field, I still find that the reports that we're here to discuss today are unique in the sense that we have used new methodologies, working across several disciplines and engaging a network of scholars at a regional level to identify the legal and implementation challenges. This is really inspiring and a novel collaboration that has been developed out of our Asia program. We're now taking these experiences to some of our other programs. So definitely it's not only in the Asia Pacific where this work will hopefully benefit, but also in other parts of the world where climate change situation is equally bad. The program in the region started in 2017 when the Raoul Wallenberg Institute and SEI initiated a thematic study on internal displacement in the context of disaster and climate change across Asia and the Pacific. This was part of a wider program, very much kindly supported by CEDA. We're very gracious for CEDA to having supported it. The program is on human rights and environment. This study focuses on law, policy, and practice in 10 countries. And as said, we have collaborated with a number of researchers across the region from China, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, the Philippines, Indonesia, Nepal, Bangladesh, the Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. And it's also very encouraging, I must say, that this collaboration between the academics involved in the regional thematic study has shaped the Asia-Pacific Academic Network on Disaster Displacement. One of the very tangible results of this network are the recommendations submitted to the UN High-Level Panel on Internal Displacement back in May 2020. And just a month later, the network also submitted the recommendations to the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons. And that's what I really like, when you sort of work from the very local up to the regional and then to the very global to the UN level, getting all those different levels anchored and getting a joined up approach to human rights is a way forward. Further, in 2020, RWI formed a partnership with 6 universities or academic institutions in 4 countries to develop a blended learning course on displacement in the context of disaster and climate change. And this is yet another effort to translate the research into action, taking it from the books, from the studies, and out where things can be changed. In this forum, I guess I hardly have to mention why the work on disaster displacement is of such a high relevance and importance. The mere fact that 25 million or more of people every year are forced to move due to a variety of disasters speaks for itself. And all projections into the future point to the fact that this will only increase in time to come, due to, in particular, the climate change. We know so well what follows from displacement for the individual. It's loss of a dignified life where you can cater for yourself and your family, and the realization of the right to work, education, and the right to health are severely limited, of course, along with other basic rights. Finally, at all continents, we have also witnessed how displacement is a major political game changer and can be the breathing ground for various populist and extremist groups. So I think there are very many good reasons to focus on the topic from a human rights perspective. Although the alertness to disaster displacement may momentarily have been pushed back following the COVID-19 pandemic, the current crisis, the current health crisis, has made the vulnerability of displaced persons abundantly clear. It sort of stands out, it cannot be ignored. We can hope and work for this clarity to be transformed into action. And here again, the 10 national legal and policy reports in front of us today, and the subsequent edited volume that will follow with specific case studies, have the potential to contribute greatly to insist on the discussions to stay on the agenda. So in this way, these reports are timely and rich on new insights. They show that national law and policy frameworks relating to disaster risk management and climate change adaptation do not systematically address the prevention and the preparedness for displacement. They also show that the absence of a human rights-based approach impedes systematic planning and management of the risks. On a more positive note, the reports tell us that those countries that have included these elements in legislation and policies actually have a head start in developing integrated approaches to addressing the challenges. This indicates that adopting a human rights-based approach to displacement in the context of disaster and climate change provides a solid foundation for a structured, systematic, and consistent strategy. Enhanced attention to human rights will not resolve the escalating challenges faced by states, but the approach can contribute to less human suffering, that no one is left behind, and a more coherent management. So colleagues, friends, I look forward to learn about the discussions here today, and of course to continue the important work with all of you. Finally, I also want to thank the RWI staff, the SEI, as well as our good partners in CEDA for making this report and this event a reality. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sorry, I'm going to say Dr. Aaron, Mr. Martin. Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. Okay, thank you for the overview research of the research on the right-based approach to displacement. Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to our two distinguished speakers who are the main editors of the Climate Change, Disaster and Internal Displacement in Asia and the Pacific, a human rights-based approach book. Dr. Matthew Scott and Dr. Albert Salamanca, they will present the key findings and reflections from their research on disasters, displacement in Asia and the Pacific. Please give a round of applause for Dr. Matthew and Dr. Albert.
Okay, well,
Scott is the head of Raoul Wallenberg Institute, People on the Move thematic area, who will be joining us online from Raoul Wallenberg Institute, headquarters in Lund, Sweden. So please meet with him.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with you in two places at once, joining virtually Bangkok and sitting personally in Lund, Sweden at the headquarters of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. For the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to take the first step in introducing you to the study that we've been conducting for the past 3 years, looking at a human rights-based approach to internal displacement in the context of disasters and climate change in Asia and the Pacific. After that, we'll hand over to my colleague Albert Salamanca, who'll go a little bit deeper into some of the case studies that are reflected in the book. In the time that I've got, I'll focus on 3 questions. The first being why, and that means why we conducted the study in the first place and why we adopted a human rights-based approach to this question. I'll then turn to the how of it, and that lays out basically what we did in the course of this 3-year research project, and also articulate what a human rights-based approach actually is in the way that we've come to understand it in the course of the study. And I can mention here, it's also an approach that we continue to develop in the collaboration that CEDA is supporting between us, the Asia Disaster Preparedness Center, Stockholm Environment Institute, and the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. So the work continues in many fronts. And finally, I'll mention some of the insights that come out of the human rights-based analysis of the legal and policy frameworks, and mention a little bit about the case studies, but leaving space for Albert to zoom in on that. So why did we do this? This slide might be familiar to many of you who work in the context of disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation. It's the report from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, which every year highlights the number of people who are internally displaced every year in the context of disasters and climate change, particularly the displacement in the context of more sudden onset hazard events, noting that it's harder to measure displacement arising for slower onset processes like sea level rise. But the blue dots on the screen show the volume of disaster-related displacement. And so it's quite easy to see immediately why we've taken a particular focus on disaster-related displacement in Asia and the Pacific. At least 70% of disaster displacement is concentrated in this region, and that's a trend that we see across many years. And as Morten mentioned earlier, 24 million people were displaced in the context of disasters and climate change last year alone. So there's good reason to focus on this issue. And there's also good reason to adopt a human rights-based approach. You can see these 4 circles connecting to the map, highlighting just some of the international level frameworks that endorse the adoption of a human rights-based approach. Significantly for people working in the context of disaster risk reduction, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction expressly endorses the adoption of a human rights-based approach at paragraph 19C of the framework, where it says, managing the risk of disasters is aimed at protecting persons and their property, health, livelihoods, and productive assets, as well as cultural and environmental assets, while promoting and protecting all human rights, including the right to development. Now, what we've managed to do over the course of the 3 years is drawing in particular on the guiding principles on internal displacement, as well as other international standards and guidelines, we've been able to articulate more clearly what a human rights-based approach actually means in this context. The guiding principles on internal displacement are particularly relevant here, having been recognized at international as well as regional levels multiple times since their adoption by the General Assembly in 1998, as being an effective tool for dealing with internal displacement. But we also noticed that the guiding principles were developed with a slightly heavier focus on conflict-related displacement and displacement in the context of other forms of physical violence, with less attention paid to the particularities of disaster-related displacement. And certainly climate change-related displacement was not really in focus at all. So that's why we've had to look at other standards and guidelines as well. Particularly noteworthy here is the UNDRR's Words into Action guidelines, which focus specifically on measures that states can take to prevent displacement, protect people during displacement, and facilitate durable solutions, specifically in the context of disaster-related displacement. That can include measures like slum upgrading, pre-identification of people in situations of vulnerability to facilitate evacuation, and many others. And I'll go into some of that in a short while. But that's the answer to why we conducted the research and why we adopted a human rights-based approach. I suppose it's also worth just articulating the point that the Sustainable Development Goals also endorse a human rights-based approach and are themselves based on human rights principles and standards as reflected in the Agenda 2030 document. So now we go into the how. And what we did in the study was first consolidate this large array of international standards and guidelines that are relevant to displacement in the context of disasters and climate change. Those standards include, as I mentioned already, the Words into Action guidelines, Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, but also the Agenda for the Protection of Persons Displaced in the context of disasters and climate change. This is a product of the Nansen Initiative, which was looking at cross-border displacement, but which recognized quite early on the importance of focusing on preventing displacement through disaster risk reduction initiatives. We also draw on the Sphere standards and the many guidelines developed by the Interagency Standing Committee, amongst others. Developing that consolidated perspective of what the international standards and guidelines already say enabled us to create a methodology for systematically reviewing the national and legal policy frameworks. And so that's what we did in relation to the 10 countries that we looked at, and those countries have been mentioned already by Morten. So we collated relevant legal and policy documents relating to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, and systematically applied a human rights-based approach as informed by those key international standards and guidelines that are reflected in the background brief that you can see. But not content to simply reflect what's contained on paper, we went further, and here collaborating with academic partners in the 10 countries, supported field level empirical research looking at particular instances of displacement, and asking questions about the role of law and policy in addressing the situation that the partners found on the ground. So to what extent measures facilitated the prevention of displacement, the protection of people during evacuation and throughout displacement, and the facilitation of durable solutions, all again informed by this human rights-based approach. So what is it? Well, we call it a human rights-based approach because it's based on the international standards and guidelines, primarily articulated in the UN treaties on human rights, but also as consolidated and focused on displacement contexts through those international standards and guidelines that are reflected there. We also drew on the 2003 UN Common Understanding on a human rights-based approach, but tried to simplify it a little bit down from 6 or 7 principles to 4, which are the procedural elements, the substantive elements, the governance elements, and the non-discrimination and equality elements. And it was those lenses with the detailed sub-elements that you can see on the screen that we applied to the legal and policy framework and to the conditions that were identified on the ground. And you can see those circles around the human rights-based approach being those phases of displacement that are built into the guiding principles on internal displacement and which structured the approach that we took in the research. And so essentially, without going into the detail of each of these sub-elements, the view that we have about this human rights-based approach is that it enables us and other actors working in this space to ask relevant questions about the situation that they're sometimes responsible for dealing with, sometimes interested in understanding from a more academic perspective. And it enables us to ask questions like, does disaster risk reduction and land use planning address the particular challenges faced by people in informal settlements? For instance, if people working in disaster risk reduction and land use planning feel a need to move people out of harm's way because they're living in an exposed area, maybe a no-build zone, how can that process be managed whilst taking into account substantive rights like the right to shelter, as well as the right to life, in the sense that people may be living in exposed areas and not integrated into disaster risk management frameworks, and therefore living in particularly exposed conditions. Time doesn't permit going into other kinds of questions that can be asked, but we develop those much further in the documents that are available on the website, the law and policy reports, as well as the snapshots. So was it worth it? Well, we did find a number of interesting points, some of which have been emphasized already by Morten, and I can echo some of them because I think they're important. The first is the case that we found a lack of systematic integration of displacement considerations in the legal and policy frameworks, which means that there was treatment of different aspects of displacement, particularly evacuation, reflecting the more long-standing focus of disaster management practice on emergency response. So there was pretty much in every country we looked at provisions relating to evacuation, far less relating to the prevention of displacement, and also much less focusing on durable solutions. And then it was also quite interesting to note that, to my surprise, human rights elements were often included in these legal and policy frameworks relating to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Emphasis particularly on addressing the situation of persons in situations of potential vulnerability. Indonesia, for instance, has a particular regulation on the rights of persons with disabilities in disaster management. Lots of focus on the gender aspect. But what we didn't see was an express adoption of a human rights-based approach, which enables this systematic engagement with the issues and the integration of the guiding principles on internal displacement. Two noteworthy exceptions here were the frameworks from Vanuatu and from Bangladesh, with both of those countries having recently developed bespoke policy documents focusing expressly from a human rights perspective on all aspects of displacement, from prevention through to durable solutions. It's too early to see the impact of the development of these frameworks, but as Morten said already, it points direction in a promising way. Now, I'll leave the space to Albert to go into the aspects relating to implementation. But to end on a visual and positive note, notwithstanding some of the limitations we saw in the legal and policy frameworks, we also did find a lot of space for further engagement. And we're really looking forward through this blended learning course, as well as through other initiatives that we hope to develop over the course of the coming years to working in this space. You can get a snapshot of the findings from the legal and policy reports. I think they may be physically available there in Bangkok, but they should also be available on the website. And this is the most consolidated version, just a one-pager to give a feeling for each of the countries. And you can also find the law and policy reports there on the website. That's it for me. Thanks so much for being here and for participating in the event. And I'll hand over to Albert.
Thanks a lot, Matthew. My name is Albert Salamanca. I'm with the Stockholm Environment Institute. So together with Matthew, we co-edited the volume which was published just recently by Routledge. And one of the authors of that volume is Carl Middleton as well here. Yeah, so while waiting for my presentation to load, so my part, I'm supposed to describe the key insights from the 8 chapters that were contained in that volume. And okay, maybe while just waiting, let me just go to the first insight that was described in the volume. One of the important aspects that we learned from in that case studies was that the definition of who is internally displaced. So this was particularly quite clear in the case of Cambodia, wherein the people who were displaced, who went to the so-called safety hill, were better catered to by the people who were left behind. No one looked after them. So in other words, the question of who suffers more from the displacement becomes quite poignant, if you like, in this particular case in Cambodia, wherein women in particular suffer because they have to be left at the home, they have to look for children, after children, they have to look after people with disabilities, because the husband has to move to the safety hill to protect their cattle, livestock in particular. So that means, and those who were left behind, no one looked after them. And a lot of the services of the government were targeted to people who move to the safety hill. So that was an important insights that we have learned from the case studies on who is really displaced in this particular situation. But okay, so I've started with the first message of the second half of my presentation, but let me just go back to the beginning of my presentation. So just postpone that thought that you have heard earlier. So this is the volume that was just been published. You might be glad to know that this was published like 2 weeks ago, but it is now on a sale, on a Black Friday sale in Routledge, so you can get very good discount for that. So let me, again, although Matthew already described the rationale on why we have to do the study and pursue it from a human rights-based perspective, let me just go through some of the facts that I think we know already very well, but just to demonstrate the point. So in 2017, that was the first time that we have gotten to 1.0 degrees temperature change since the industrial period, or the beginning of the industrial period. So 2017. By around 2030, we're expected to get to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And we know when we get to the point, a lot of things could happen. A lot of ecosystems will suffer, and planetary thresholds could be breached. And in fact, right now, we've seen this one in terms of an average annual losses per hazards in Southeast Asia, wherein drought in particular is increasing and accounts for 60% of the annual losses in 2018, which is around that year about 87 billion US dollars. So once you factor in slow onset events, particularly drought, the losses are really quite staggering. And also in 2016, the 10 largest displacement during that year were climate related. And at that point, it was forecasted to increase. And Asia Pacific region has been shown to suffer from climate related displacement. And in fact, a similar data that was quoted by Matt, 75% of new displacement in 2019 were disaster related. And 96% of these disaster displacements were weather related. So in other words, a lot of people have been displaced. And if you go through this particular report for that year, it is the first time that Myanmar in particular has seen the highest number of displacement. But this is the challenge. So right now, 2020, so you notice that in 2017, that was only 1 degree centigrade change. In 2020, we are now at 1.1 degrees centigrade, and it's climbing up, so that it's forecasted by year 2100, we will change, the temperature would have changed to 2.9 degrees centigrade. And even if we achieve all the pledges and targets, temperature would still change by 2.7 degrees centigrade. So in other words, more displacements would still happen unless we are going to act quite responsibly on the causes of displacement, and also helping those communities that are vulnerable adapt to displacement. So in the case studies, we've looked at flooding, typhoon or cyclones, and then we also look at, because we were interested in disasters, volcanic eruption and earthquakes. So in flooding, we had case studies in Thailand, Cambodia, Solomon Islands, and in terms of typhoon or cyclone, Philippines, Vanuatu, Bangladesh, and then the volcanic eruption was the Mount Sinabung in Indonesia, and then the earthquake in Nepal. And this particular insight with respect to the integration of internal displacement in different policies, this is the point that Matt has highlighted earlier. So I will not go into this. The same with these ones with respect to international standards and guidelines. And this is the one that I earlier talked about, the whole notion of who is really displaced. I think it's important to ask that question because based on existing experiences in the case studies that we have seen, the people who are considered displaced are much more serviced, if you like, than those who are left behind. And then another aspects also that we found in the study is that there's a tendency in a lot of DRR frameworks in the case studies to be ableist. In other words, they tend to prioritize or privilege those who are able-bodied people rather than those people with differential abilities. So that's an important issue because in a few cases that we have seen, those households with persons with abilities suffer more. So like, for example, in that example in Cambodia, wherein women were not able to be evacuated because they had to stay behind and look after those people with disabilities. The second is that there's a lot still of gender issues especially in evacuation sites, because despite all the standards, so the man, for example, the sphere, or even in the guiding principles, the design of evacuation sites still does not cater to the needs of women. So for example, just a very simple, like privacy in using the toilets. The toilets are designed in a way that it's quite public and they're really not suitable for the private needs of women. And also, there's also this tendency to think that, at least in the case studies that we have done, women are treated as if they're the ones who need the information, because accordingly, men already knew what to do. So this is actually additional task to the reproductive work of women, because that means they have to look after evacuation, they have to look after the welfare of the family. At the same time, they have to worry a lot about a lot of things. And then also there's a tendency that when it comes to evacuation, it's the men who will move together with their properties, and women are stayed behind because, as I've said, they look after other family members who are not able to move. And also there has been increase in gender-based violence. And people, for example, people who are members of LGBTQI communities are not considered. So in other words, one important issue in the evacuation sites and in planning for relocation or displacement is that there's a lack of appreciation of the unique needs of women, persons with disabilities, elderly, and children in the evacuation sites. And also, although we would say that indigenous knowledge, indigenous form of governance, such as the chiefly system in Vanuatu, is quite crucial when it comes to disasters. But this indigenous system is also male-dominated, and women are not represented. So it tends to privilege only the perspectives and the views of men in these traditional societies. So again, that's one issue that we need to really look at, because it's not representative of the entire community. The other issues is that those who are relocated in the different relocation sites do not have property rights. In other words, they don't own the land. So they tend to come back to areas where they are potentially threatened by disasters. Or there are also certain places where in the relocation sites, so like for example, in Yolanda affected areas in the Philippines, the relocation sites are quite far from sources of livelihoods, so that communities would have to keep on coming back to vulnerable areas so that they can carry out their livelihoods. The other point also is that some of these communities are still living in informal settlements. So the potential for protective displacement is still very high in those communities. And a few examples, or also in the case studies, is that although it's being articulated in the different international guidelines for free and informed consent before to forced evacuation, it's not being followed. A lot of the governments still do not follow securing free and informed consent of the people to be evacuated. That's one of the reasons that explains why some people, like for example, people with disabilities or the elderly, are moved to a place and then without thinking the kind of support system that these kinds of people would need, because governments did not seek out consent from these people. But there were also a lot of best practices that we have found. So this is particularly in the case of Thailand, and maybe Carl can say more about this later, is that there were community health volunteers available who actually check house to house. So this is in particular an example in Hadjai in southern Thailand, wherein they check in each of the households who are the vulnerable people and who need special care. And then they also have volunteer warning house volunteers. So these are the people who would provide early warning information to those who will be affected. And also they have also this so-called volunteer mentor houses. So this is where volunteers are trained about how to respond to the particular disaster. So these examples are described in the Thai case studies in particular in the volume. So it's worth noting that despite also some of the negative messages that we have found in the case studies, there are some important nuggets that we can learn from. And finally, we thought that more research is really needed to understand the intersection of displacement and the, sustainable development and climate change adaptation. And especially thinking in terms of the roles of other actors. So for example, in urban planning, housing, environment, and development to address internal displacement. With that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Albert. Dr. Albert is our senior research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute Asia Center, where he leads its climate change, disaster, and development cluster. Thank you very much. Actually, we're going to have to take a coffee break for 20 minutes, but due to we're running red right now, so we're not going to take a break. Is everyone okay? Yeah, you should be okay. So we will now transition to the next panel discussions on the rice bread approach from words to actions. It will be fun with this session. So I would like to invite our moderator, Mr. Dr. Carl Middleton. Please give him a round of applause, please. Dr. Carl Middleton is an assistant professor and deputy director for research on the Master of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy in International Development Study Program and director of the Center for Social Development Studies in the Faculty of Political Science of Chulalongkorn University. His title is so long. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Is that working? Yes, I think, okay, great. Thank you. I thought I was going to have to be the person to bring the bad news of no coffee break. So thank you very much. If you want to get coffee, you can quickly pop outside and get it. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation to moderate this session. We've already had an excellent framing to the purpose of this panel discussion already. The opening remarks have highlighted the importance of deepening our understanding about the relationship between displacement and climate and disaster. And it was also emphasized how these impacts are disproportionately experienced in Asia and the Pacific. Then Matthew Scott and Albert Salamanca have clearly outlined the research that's been undertaken that's an input today. There's been 8 case studies that are a snapshot of some of the bigger challenges across the region, but also some of the opportunities. Matthew also emphasized the importance of legal approaches and the opportunities within a human rights-based approach to disaster and displacement. The purpose of this panel is to interact with a number of experts in this field beyond the research itself. And the challenges that we've been given as a topic is from words into action. So the idea for this panel is to have an interactive discussion, not based on PowerPoints. Instead, we have 3 questions about the challenges of implementing a human rights-based approach, the opportunities, and then we will invite each of the panelists to share some of the work of their own organizations and what they've learned from this. So please allow me to first introduce the 4 participants on the panel. We have 1 person in person. I'm very glad to be on the panel with somebody. And then we have 3 who are joining us online. Thank you very much for joining us. I will start with Dr. Pia Oberoi, who is sitting beside me on the panel. She is the Senior Advisor on Migration and Human Rights for the Asia Pacific region based in Bangkok, with the United Nations Human Rights Office, where she is responsible for developing and implementing research and policy on migration and human rights in the region. Previous to this role, she was the head of the migration team at the UN Human Rights Headquarters in Geneva, where she led the office's global work on policy and legal issues related to the human rights of migrants and the intersection with migration and human rights. Joining us online, we have Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, who is a professor of political science at the University of Dhaka and the founding chair of the Refugee and Migratory Movements Research Unit, which is the premier migration think tank of Bangladesh. She has researched and published widely on climate change adaptation and migration, the drivers and impacts of internal and international male and female labor migration, migration governance, diaspora remittances, and safe and sustainable cities inclusive to migrants. She has also been very active on public policy in Bangladesh and internationally, including leading the drafting of the national strategy on the management of disaster and climate-induced internal displacement. The bios could be far longer. I'm very happy that we have such an esteemed group on the panel. I just keep these brief so that we have more time to hear from you directly. Then we also have Ms. Raina Bermudez, who leads the Center for Crisis, Climate and Conflict Humanitarian Protection, which is the focal office within the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines, who works on human rights issues in crisis and conflict situations. She has 10 years experience of progressive experience in humanitarian protection work, development programming, and peace advocacy, particularly in conflict and disaster affected areas in the southern Philippines. So thank you so much. And I want to check, is Mr. Hans Gutmann also online? I don't see him at present. So maybe I won't introduce him for now. And if he joins, then I will introduce him onto the panel. Is there one more person? Okay, I think in the interest of time, we'll begin the panel. So the idea is to have brief interventions and a discussion between us about the 3 questions that I mentioned at the beginning. And then after that, we will invite discussion with those in the room and those who are joining us virtually online that I think could either be addressed to the panel or to Matthew and Albert, who presented some of the key findings of the book. So let's begin with the first question across the panel, which is, in your experience, what are the challenges in implementing a rights-based approach in disaster displacement? So I think there are 3 of us. Maybe let's begin with Dr. Tasneem online, and then we'll come back to the room with Pia, and then we'll go back online again to Raina, if that's okay. So Dr. Siddiqui,
I couldn't hear you properly. Is the question?
2 or 3 minutes.
The question is, yeah. So the question, can you repeat? Just repeat the question.
The question is, what are the challenges in implementing a rights-based approach in disaster displacement? What are the challenges?
Okay, I think I couldn't hear you, but what I understand, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, okay. No, like what are the challenges if I feel, if a right-based
Matthew is also
face. I think the main challenge that I would identify is lack of knowledge and lack of understanding and a fear about right-based approach. But if you can make governments, different governments understand that right-based approach is nothing, that if you commit yourself to that, then you are going to be accountable in different UN forums with that. If you can make them understand what you are accountable for is not actually what you are doing, maybe in reality. So the framework, I would say, that this particular study has come up with, where it, identified that the international documents, if you look into guiding principles, Sandine framework, Sustainable Development Goals. All these, the way it created the framework, and then this whole issue of non-discrimination, governance, and procedural aspects, and substantive issues. The way the framework is developed, if you inform government functionaries with such a framework, I would say major challenge, major hindrance of taking them on board will be over if this framework, this simple framework, can be communicated. And second is, I think, like one thing, if I just mention, in the university, in the Ministry of Disaster, when we were introducing this strategic document, when I say durable solution, we were insisting that why don't we say sustainable development? So you understand the lack of understanding about durable solution and 3 stages, like 3 things of durable solution: prevention, then during displacement, and after, you know, if this type of misunderstanding can be facilitated by information, then I would say another challenge will be met. And the third, if you think, in our academic arena, the way we teach disaster only concentrates on one phase, that is the phase during displacement. So if prevention and durable curriculums of universities, that's of all these curriculums of universities, that's, so I think I'll stop here later as well. I'll stop here later as well. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. That was very concise and very clear, and very important points about the need to build understanding about the framework that's been proposed. Thank you. So let's return to the room for Dr. Pierre.
Thank you very much, Carl. Maybe I'll just take a step back and look at the challenges really conceptually to identify what the human rights issues are in relation particularly to slow onset disasters and the adverse effects of climate change. I think that the challenge there is about the complexity and the multi-causality of this movement. And I think that the research kind of goes in a bit to understand that direction, because in trying to understand how to respond to it, obviously your first question is, when do people move? You know, what kind of tipping point are you at where some people move, as you explained, and some people don't, and how that displacement takes place, why that choice is made. And I would argue that there is always, even in the context of a forced displacement, there is always some element of choice that goes into the decision making, and how then people are able to or compelled to move. All of these different aspects of, and I say that we at OHCHR, we have focused a bit on slow onset movements, just because the understanding, you know, when you have a sea level rise situation, or you have a situation of desertification or glacial retreat, etc., where the understanding, the tipping points, the what makes that become something where people are forced to move is less obvious in a sense. So I would really say that some of the challenges are conceptual. I mean, the human rights challenges have been well identified through the research, and I think that's an important thing to say, that the disproportionate effect on people that are poor and already vulnerable then exacerbates the challenge of responding in a human rights-based way, because you have people that are, in a sense, already marginalized and already excluded in general, in the context of your social planning, in terms of your disaster response planning going ahead. So I think this leads then to the challenge of being able to identify people that are displaced, as was pointed out before, but also where they are. And I think, again, if we look at the slow onset processes, there is a focus on where you can kind of identify people, those people that have been moved into camp settings, for instance, have been relocated to particular areas where we see them, but perhaps not so much emphasis or not so much attention to people that are internally displaced in urban areas that may have moved, either from a rural area or moved within an urban area to a more precarious area. So I think that these are all elements of challenge that are brought to us when we try to understand how the human rights framework can address the vulnerability in the context of disaster displacement.
Thank you so much. Thinking about some of the chapters that we have in the book, I think one of the themes that comes across in a number is how existing vulnerabilities become deepened or continue to grow as people experience different forms of disaster and the types of support that they do or do not get from states. So now let's return online to Raina for your response. Thank you for the first question.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. Am I clear? Yes, okay. So our co-panelists have already shared some more on what are the issues of HRBA in implementing measures. But from my end, I think I'd like to contribute mostly on human rights as a concept that is usually misconstrued and capable of being part of a misconception on the part of duty bearers primarily, in the way that there is the thought that when they implement something and they in a way respond to some human rights standards without necessarily looking deeper into what are the substantive and normative aspects of it, that's where a huge gap is surfacing. So in the case of the Philippines, we get to see that there are legislation, particularly those with the procedures and systems that are already in place, but at the same time, if you look at them, substantive and normative aspects of human rights implementation are not there. So there are also some instances wherein the emergency nature of responding to disaster displacements is being used to curb human rights, and also some human rights elements such as public participation, respect for dignity of persons are not really looked into as regards the response that are being implemented and shared to displaced persons. So there are these gaps looking into the procedural aspect that do not translate into a more human rights focused response to communities. So this is where we are seeing a lot of issues, and hopefully as we move forward with a mainstream human rights based approach to different from different government agencies, particularly since they are the duty bearers, then we get to have a better conception of what human rights would mean to communities that are affected by disaster displacements.
Thank you very much for the concise answer and emphasizing the challenges of when a disaster occurs, whether a human rights-based approach is fully implemented, for example, in terms of people's participation. The second round of questions that we'd like to ask to the panel is related more looking forward. What types of opportunities do you see to respond to the challenges that have been outlined, maybe both by the presentation of the book and also in your own experience? So I think we could go in the same order again. Can we invite Dr. Siddiqui to first share some of your thoughts on opportunities and ways forward? Thank you.
I think this whole issue, like good research, has to be, transformed into actions. This particular research, as I see, that has a lot of potential to be materialized. First of all, they have already taken an initiative of developing a blended learning course, and that can be taught into different universities And also, that can be short courses on government functionaries. And we know civil society organizations, they're very much right-based, but they do need framework, conceptual framework, and how to put different rights, disaster-induced displacement. So this is where I see in future dissemination of knowledge on this particular, what this book has come up with. That will be an important much into discussion today, that not everyone is affected, brought to the fore, so that one solution does not fit all can come in. Like if I share just one example, the study we recently did in Chattogram, one of the mega cities in Bangladesh, and where people from plainland came, where people from all over Bangladesh came. So issues from plainland and hill people is completely different. Just a simple urban, theological, religious, or other sustenance, they have mosques and other things, temples, but hill population, when they came here, and they were looking for place to congregation place, and then that is something that is unique to ethnic communities. So when you bring in these aspects in continuous discussion, then the projects, city development, and others can become a more migrant-friendly, new migrant-friendly. I think that is where all these city development organizations, mayor office, they should be informed about this type of changes or this type of things that accommodating inclusive city development. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, excellent points. Probably as a researcher, one of the challenges is really seeing how research transforms into action. And I feel that at least in the process of this, preparing this research, the role of the RWI and SEI, who have their own experience in transforming, engaging in policy processes through the process of actually creating research, has resulted not just in policy briefs, but really engaging in policy processes as well. So now let's return back to the room for Dr. Oberoi.
Thank you very much. Just very quickly, I think maybe 2 points. One is that the opportunities, obviously, that the human rights framework provides us are precisely what was noted in the previous presentations, which is that we have the tools there to understand specifically, to disaggregate vulnerability, to understand which individuals, which groups need to be the focus of policy planning. I think what the human rights framework does in addition is that it removes some of the silos that we could have. I mean, we talked about, the emergency bias, for instance, that could take place in the context of disasters and planning to deal with them. But a human rights framework obviously gives us a comprehensive understanding of the various issue areas, and then the various ministries, for instance, or the various government departments that should be involved. So not just NDMOs, but also child protection, also health, also housing. Why not also looking at, for instance, national action plans on health, or various, kind of policy or regulatory frameworks related, as we discussed, to urban planning or the right to housing. So these are all, because of the comprehensiveness of the human rights framework, you are able to kind of have a policy process, a policy framework, which kind of looks at the whole. The second point, the second opportunity that I wanted to highlight really comes from OHCHR's focus, which has also been looking very much at cross-border displacement. And while understanding that obviously most of the displacement that we will see in this context will be internal, I don't think that we can disregard the importance of looking at when some movement may be cross-border, but also because of the particular legal and policy gaps. And there, I think there is an opportunity, not just in the international frameworks that we have. We have the Global Compact for Migration, which provides an important review going ahead next year. but also to look more broadly at migration governance and the idea of migration as adaptation, which is kind of baked into a lot of the conversations we have around climate change and disaster displacement. I think in the context of the COVID pandemic, we've seen how the migration adaptation, the current frameworks that we have are really very often not fit for purpose. The temporary labor migration modalities that we have in place in our region have caused and will continue to cause human rights challenges. So I think, again, an opportunity is to kind of look comprehensively at mobility to understand where there might be opportunities to bring the human rights lens in and to understand the kinds of responses that will protect, respect, and fulfill rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's now return back to online to Raina.
Yes, thank you. So, yeah, there's quite a surround, sorry. Yeah. So, with the discussion on what could be the opportunities for HRBA inclusion in the processes in relation to displacement, disaster displacement, one of the opportunities that we see is having a legislation, particularly a law that focuses on supporting communities that are displaced and having a human rights-based approach integrated into that law. So why is it that it's important to have that policy in place? It's that because one, procedure-wise, we can see that the agencies of a government, for example, will be able to integrate human rights in the provision of services that they will be conducting. Also, it will open opportunities for civil society organizations, non-government organizations, and also international groups to participate in the process of accessing communities and delivering services, for example, and also assisting in empowering communities to become self-reliant. So these are aspects of human rights that could be further improved when the opportunities are open to different actors. Also, a human rights legislation on displacement management can also see an empowerment of a human rights institution, for example, and other similar institutions and entities that can now fully assert and exercise their mandate in relation to ensuring that human rights are integrated in humanitarian action, particularly by duty bearers. Human rights-based approach also entails that accountability must be in place. So our duty bearers must be able to provide their services, they act on their mandate, ensure that people's rights are protected and promoted in the process of, in the situation of displacement and moving towards their durable solution. So yeah, I think having a specific legislation on that can be very helpful, both on the substantive aspect and on the procedural aspect. So there, thank you.
So thank you for highlighting both the importance of reflecting human rights-based approaches into law, but then also recognizing that in addition to the role of state, there are also important roles for civil society and other actors as well. For the third question for the panel, we'd like to ask you if you could share from your own work and experience some of the ways that your work is contributing towards finding or implementing solutions around forced displacement and disaster. After this round of questions, then we would like to invite questions from the floor, or those of you that are online can also ask questions or share your comments in the chat box. I think it should be possible also to ask the question directly. So, and the questions can also be for the book editors, Matthew Scott and Albert Salamanca as well. Okay, so let's go to the panel first and invite Dr. Siddiqui to share on your experience of some work that you've been undertaking recently on this topic. Thank you. Could you sorry, could you unmute? Thank you. Still muted, unfortunately. Can you open the video or not? We need you to unmute from your end, I'm afraid. I think in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Okay.
Okay, can I, okay, I'm sorry about that. Something went wrong. So let me just say that in the book, the national strategy has been mentioned. And that national strategy on internally displaced persons, both climate and disaster, you can see it's very much a human rights-based approach, and very much based on all the documents this book has mentioned. So while preparing that, we have seen that when you take government and others with you, you do can make them come up with new law or come up with new strategy. And I think that's a good example, this national strategy. And the other thing, now this Chittagong city development plan is going on. It is based on our research. We used photo elicitation sort of research methodology, where we used migrants, newly coming migrants, and the city planners, and they took picture how they want to develop the city. And then when we put these two groups together, and what people want and what the city planner thought initially, and this whole thing changed the mindset, and looking at others into the low-skilled workers has changed. And now we are supporting this Chittagong city planners to make it more inclusive to the migrants, and listening to what migrants are saying as priority rather than only the priority of the city planners. I think this is another good example, which I'm happy to share. Thank you.
Very much. You might receive some questions with more details for those interesting strategies and plans. Thank you. Let's return to the room for Dr. Pia.
Thank you very much. And as I'm here representing CHR, I thought maybe I'd speak a little bit about some of the frameworks and the work that is coming out of the international human rights system. We obviously have the work of the independent human rights mechanisms, and the recent report of the Special Rapporteur on IDPs was mentioned. But I did also want to encourage you to look back through the archives of the guidance and the work of special procedures. For instance, the 2007 guidelines on development-based evictions of the former Special Rapporteur on Housing, which has a wealth of detail in safeguarding in the context of planned relocations and evacuations. So we have that, as well as jurisprudence of the Human Rights Committee, most recently on environmental and displacement issues. We've also published a couple of years ago a set of principles and guidelines on the human rights protection of migrants in vulnerable situations. And these apply, obviously, they're based on human rights law and standards. And in the context of the discussion that you're having today, they obviously apply mainly to cross-border migrants, but they apply by analogy to everybody that is displaced internally, because they're based on international human rights law, which applies equally. At the regional level here in our office in Bangkok, we have just embarked on a multi-year kind of program that's been supported by Sweden on migration and on climate change. And again, we hope to use that to support, for instance, the work of national human rights institutions in making those linkages between human rights and displacement. We're also finalizing some work, a piece of research on pathways for entry and stay within the Asia-Pacific region that also look at how governments are kind of using innovative, or not in some cases, using innovative protection entry and stay pathways, so visa arrangements or other pathways to fulfill their human rights obligations. And some of these are in the context of disasters and environmental degradation. So it's quite interesting to see how governments, and particularly now in the context of COVID, are trying to understand what happens if people are displaced, unable to go back, migrants that are stuck, unable to go back. And finally, in the Pacific, we are part of a multi-agency and multi-stakeholder initiative on human security and climate change, which seeks to support governments in the Pacific to build a regional rights-based framework on climate change and disaster-related migration, displacement, and planned relocation. So really trying to, again, bring the tools of the human rights framework to the attention of government stakeholders to enable them to put in place policies and practices that respect rights. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And now let's return to the Philippines for an intervention from Raina.
Yes, thank you. So I come here to represent the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines. So it's a national human rights institution which enjoys the mandate from the Constitution to ensure that human rights are protected and promoted, particularly by the duty bearers. So coming from that mandate of the Commission, how we now integrate human rights-based approach in addressing displacement issues. We conduct our monitoring activities, particularly through the use of our own monitoring tool that is rooted on human rights standards and other humanitarian standards in looking into the situation of displaced persons. What the information, the data that come from our activities also form part of the recommendations that we provide to the national government. We also exercise our mandate in conducting inquiries in relation to human rights issues of communities, particularly for our unit would be on displaced persons. So we're conducting a national inquiry on internally displaced persons, particularly looking at the duty bearers' response to IDP issues and juxtaposing it with the real experiences of displaced persons on the ground. So we look into these two sides and look at the gaps that must be filled in order for the government to be able to fully and meaningfully address the issues of communities, and at the same time for the communities to bridge their concerns to the government, since the Commission enjoys a specific mandate that the state must also respect. So that, and then we also support the different lobbying activities in relation to the passage of a legislation focusing on rights of displaced communities. So from that displacement perspective, that's what the Commission is currently doing. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. So we've had 3 rounds of interesting sharing of experience. We've discussed some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, and some of the solutions that each of the organizations that are represented have undertaken themselves. Now I'd like to open the discussion up. If anybody that is either physically in the room or online would like to share your comments or have questions either for our 3 panelists or for Matthew and Albert, who presented on the book earlier. I saw that there was at least one question that came in for Pia. But let's maybe take a couple more first and see, get a sense of how many questions there are to ask or experience to share. Okay. So I'll collect a couple of questions. I think so they can hear you online.
So, yeah, thanks for these really interesting presentations and discussions. I had a question about, it goes back to the first chart you showed with the map of Asia and the Pacific and the number of people displaced. And in that data that was shown, it's not disaggregated. And of course, we know why that is. There's very little disaggregated data available because, I mean, even though Sendai is asking for this, it's not something that countries have been able to respond to for different reasons. But I want to ask, I mean, how can we get data that will help sort of make your argument and make the argument stronger that rights-based approaches, gender-inclusive approaches, including disability in DRR, I mean, how do we go forward? Because I think that we know intuitively that this is true and important, that these are issues, but on the other hand, without the data, it becomes difficult to convince perhaps people that don't share that feeling that this is a true need. And then the second question is, maybe it's in this published book that's coming, and you mentioned, Albert, you mentioned the case of Cambodia and people going to the hill with the cattle and then others being left behind. But I think that as I've been following DRR in the last year, I often miss those really practical stories that explain how an inclusive approach to DRR resulted in this kind of positive outcome versus, you know, the status quo. But it seems like there's a difficulty to sort of come up with these examples that really show that we applied a human rights-based approach, and then we saw that it made a difference in this way, in a way that is the people that work with DRR at the national organizations, that they can see these examples and say, ah, yeah, working in this way makes my work easier. It's going to make it easier for me to be effective. Because on the other side, of course, the more people you include, the more discussion, the more interests, and one can also come to the conclusion that a broader, more inclusive approach makes it more difficult to get one's job done. So I really would like to see more of those examples of where inclusive approaches make it easier to get the job done.
Two very, very good questions. I think the first question on the disaggregation of data might be best addressed by Matthew, who shared the original slide. But I think the second question is for the whole panel, as well as for Albert and Matthew, because I think that you'll each have your own perspective on how a practical experience of a human rights-based approach has made a difference or not yet in terms of outcomes for addressing disaster and displacement. I think there was one question I saw came up in the chat box. Can we see that? I think it was for Pia. Let's take, whilst we find the chat box, let's take those two questions first. Matthew, are you still online? And can you join us on the stage for a second?
Can you see me and hear me? I'm here. Great, great. So it's a bit of an echo, but I can happily respond to the questions by Aaron. In relation to the kind of evidence base, I mean, this is actually something that we started grappling with early in the process, both in the context of this disaster displacement study, but also in the work that we're doing in that consortium that I mentioned with ADPC, SEI, and Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. Where's the proof if we adopt this kind of approach? And that can be difficult because there's not a lot of studies that are emphasizing. Sorry, I'm hearing my voice echo. It's a little bit hard. But there aren't a lot of studies that look for the good practice. And actually, one way to highlight the relevance and importance of a human rights-based approach is to look the other way and to see what happens when it's not adopted. And that's what we can demonstrate with the edited volume that just came out that we're talking about today, which shows in multiple situations relating to prevention of displacement, protecting people during displacement and in evacuation contexts, and in relation to durable solutions, when the elements that are reflected in that human rights-based approach aren't adopted, when the legal and policy framework doesn't reflect elements of participation, focus on the situation of people in situations of vulnerability, people tend to get left behind. And we see that in a number of the case studies. I can take out an example from Vanuatu, for instance, in Cyclone Pam, where at the time of Cyclone Pam, the legal and policy framework did not reflect a human rights-based approach, did not reflect the guiding principles on internal displacement. And in the case study relating to the evacuation of Matasu Island, there were concerns raised about forced evacuation without consultation and without taking into account the voices and particular concerns of women and older people and people with disabilities who were the ones who were moved. So the case study is quite detailed and demonstrates a human rights-based approach really well, and highlights what happens when you don't adopt that approach. So I think that's what this study shows more than the good practice. It shows situations where there are really challenges. But we can also take examples from the work that we're doing in this consortium, where we're collecting examples of good practice in as part of a regional technical working group on inclusive approaches to emergency preparedness for response. And in that context, I can mention examples from the Philippines, where the support for the development of organizations of persons with disabilities and inclusion of that representation in in local disaster coordination committees led to the development of more attuned early warning systems. And right now we're getting case studies developed on how that's worked out in practice, but we've already got insights on the good in itself, which kind of goes to that second question about impacts. Increasing the participation of persons in decision-making around issues that affect their lives is a good in itself from a human rights-based approach. Participation itself is a human right, and people need to be involved in decisions that affect them. So those are some early reflections. I can get involved in some of those other questions, but I'll step back for now.
Would any of the panelists like to respond to these first two questions? Would you like to respond? I think you'll need to unmute. Okay.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that think of children's voice. You do hear gender, male and female friends, but we have hardly hear children's voice. Then this inclusive approach, when we develop this strategy, then the voice of the children, like they're saying what is their problem when there is no land, those issues. And then second is waterlogging and how they go to school. They identified and lack of space for playing in the areas. These are the things they identified. So, right-based approach and giving voice to unheard, those who have not been heard before. I think that is an important issue that actually then everyone takes into account. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall we return to the room?
I just wanted to very quickly reflect a bit on the question around, how to use these practical stories, because I agree. I mean, it was really compelling to hear that story and to think about what that meant. I think that one of the difficulties with this conversation and with many of these kind of policy conversations is that they can be very siloed. The language that we speak, I don't mean just the which kind of language it is, but the terminology that we use can be so specific to one particular area that it's almost impossible to decipher in other areas. And I speak as somebody that does not really work in the DRR world, and I find some of the terminology baffling, as probably a lot of people that come into the world of human rights find it slightly alienating or difficult to do. And so I would really, the kinds of cross-stakeholder, multi-sectoral discussion that we've had today, I think is precisely the way to also unlock some of those barriers and to start to speak a common language, if you will. And again, I think human rights provides us, some of that benchmarking. I just didn't want to make a little personal bugbear about data, because I agree that it is very difficult data capture, particularly on human rights issues. And the SDGs framework has really struggled a bit with trying to ensure that we have that disaggregation through, for instance, all the SDG goals. But as Matthew said, that doesn't stop you making human rights-based policy. And the fact that you don't have data doesn't mean that the policies can't be made, because the obligations are still there. So yes, I agree it's important to be able to convince, but I would also then go back as a legal purist and say that you still have those obligations under the human rights treaties.
Thank you very much. I think this also relates to a point that Dr. Siddiqui mentioned at the beginning about how research translates into action. I mean, data can just literally be raw data, but how it transforms itself to become analysis, which is the process of what research is supposed to do, but then also how it becomes knowledge that can actually be acted upon. I think that is a different discussion from just doing research. And I think when we talk about knowledge, as is here is suggesting here, it's the type of knowledge that becomes actionable. I think it's being recognized nowadays that it has to be quite holistic. To make something work in real life, it can't just come from specialists. It can't just come from law. It can't just come from DRR people, but it has to involve like researchers, government types of knowledge, politicians type of knowledge, civil society knowledge, and community knowledge especially, I think. Albert has an intervention, and then we will return to Reina in the Philippines.
Just a quick one on the issue of data. I think one thing that we need to recognize is that all the insights that we currently have with respect to internal displacement is based on the impacts of sudden onset events. We don't have a lot of information when it comes to slow onset events. In fact, the UN ESCAP report that I cited earlier, it was the first time that they have a drought data in their reporting, because as Aubrey I think mentioned earlier, that triggering points, the tipping points for slow onset events are really quite hard to unravel. It's really quite hard to understand. So you don't know when households are actually suffering from the impact of a drought, for example, because it depends on, for example, their ability to adapt, the kinds of livelihoods, the access to certain kinds of capital. So reporting that as an impact of slow onset events is really quite tricky, I think. And I think that's where a lot of research needs to be done to be able to track, and also the early warning system that can actually trigger that kind of information to flow. Because even like, for example, if you look at the reporting in IDMC and also even in the region with the ASEAN Humanitarian Center, it's still very much based on sudden onset events. And the case studies that information there is really based about sudden onset events. There's really less information yet. A lot of work being made is still very much ongoing. So for example, there was a mention of slow sea level rise as a slow onset event. Even that particular phenomenon for the region is still not well understood. We understand it globally, that there is such a thing as sea level rise, but as to how it affects each and every country in the region, we actually don't know. So if we don't know, then we don't have the right information as well. So it's still really quite tricky, and still, I think, I would imagine a huge task to do.
Thank you, Albert. Let's return online to Reina.
Yes, thank you. So I'll what are the impacts, or should, if there are impacts, or how it could make impact to have a human rights-based approach to disaster displacements. Well, one human rights-based approach would open avenues for different actors to be part of the process, to integrate people's voices into the process of supporting communities in relation to disaster displacements. So that's one. Though now it's still a work in progress, even here in the Philippines, though we see that there are now legislation that focus on supporting communities in post-emergency. So we have our DRRM law, we have our Children in Emergency Situation law, and other measures. These are all on, the implementation is all ongoing. It's still not perfect, but at least human rights now is being mainstreamed little by little into these processes. So we now see inclusion of vulnerable sectors. There's now there are now procedures and mechanisms to cascade information to provide support to communities. But again, those are mostly focused on procedures, not so much on the norms and standards. So that's one part that we can work on. So for example, what does it mean to have a shelter? Is shelter simply a structure, or would that include the different aspects of it? These are human rights issues that if we're just going to look at the procedural aspect, then we'll just have a shelter. But the other aspects might be not included or maybe missed out in the process of response. So yeah, impacts, they're still ongoing. There are now options and opportunities for communities to integrate themselves in the decision-making process. So we're hopeful that as we move forward, the impacts will be stronger and more meaningful for communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have two questions that have come in online. The first is to Dr. Pia, which is, in terms of human rights-based approaches, as the opportunity for disaggregating vulnerability, how do you think this can be operationalized into research and data collection to address or critique the shortcomings of migration as adaptation approach? And then there's a question to Matthew and Albert, but I think it could apply to the whole panel. To what extent did you find in your research the involvement of human rights actors or experts such as national human rights institutions in national law and policy dealing with displacement and disaster? And do you have any recommendations on this? I think on how to expand their roles. I want to throw in my own extra question here. Firstly, because we have a representative from a national human rights institution on the panel, but also Pia mentions your work with national human rights institutions across the region. And the question that I wanted to ask is, are there any particular opportunities or challenges that national human rights institutions face or could take up that can further mainstream human rights into this issue of climate change? Because I think that a lot of the discussions when it comes to climate change are also quite high level, things like economic policy, for example. So are there particular barriers that are faced or particular arguments that could be put forward to talk about human rights-based approaches to dealing with climate change, including related to disaster and displacement? Then I also wanted to ask a specific question to Dr. Siddiqui, because you shared what seems to be a success in your work for the government adopting a national strategy on internally displaced people in Bangladesh. And I think related to this question might be, what were the circumstances that you found that made the government open to the argument that a human rights-based approach would be the most appropriate way to design the strategy? Thank you. Start with Dr. Siddiqui, and then we'll come back to the room.
Okay, I'll just handle your last question that you asked. Others can look into the others. I would say it's a long drawn process. It is not just immediately it happens. we started this whole exercise in 2015. And when we started, what we did, continue civil society, IOM, ILO, and related organizations, and introduce this whole framework, then this, displacement sort of principles, all these things we started discussing, and not immediately everyone bought it. Even civil society representatives didn't buy it. Those who are into climate silo, I would say those who are with Environment Ministry, working, developing NAPA, National Action Plan, Adaptation Action, Climate Change Adaptation Action Plan, or those who were, BCC SAP, that is the, strategy for government, they were very apprehensive because they didn't even want to include displacement and disaster-induced displacement, because migration was like a, what should I say, migration itself was seen as a threat. They didn't like to bring it as an adaptation tool either. So, it was newspaper writings, then continuous meeting with these secretaries, joint secretaries, inviting them into different forums. And gradually, when we prepared the framework, then they saw that, okay, it is not that, not that bad. It's not that people will come and attack them if they don't implement all these things. So some kind of assurance developed over a long period of time. Then you become successful. It's not just, you can, you do a work and then you can leave it. But Matthew knows, we never, let the thing wither out. We kept on pushing on the issue continuously. I think that's the role of activist researcher. That's very important to make government understand. And you also have to have certain credibility that you won't put things into jeopardy. So you also have to have that when you are proposing. So thank you.
Back to the room to online again to Rainer, and then also to Matthew, and then to Albert, if you have any final responses to the questions.
Thanks very much, Carl. Maybe just to answer first the question around migration as adaptation and how research and data collection can kind of shed light on some of these issues. I mean, obviously, some of it is part of our discussion earlier about how to ensure that you're getting the research and the data that you need and how you're going to operationalize that. But I think the conceptual kind of questions behind that really are about, as I said, a critique of the migration governance framework, starting from what happens when people are internally displaced or have to move internally, and understanding that migration, whether internal or cross-border, lies along a continuum between forced and voluntary. And so that when you have these programs that are put in place and they're lauded as migration as adaptation, people can take that opportunity to move proactively and move preemptively as a way to have a positive outcome in relation to the disasters and climate change. I think we have to understand that the limitations or the absence of choice that accompany the person, even when they choose to take on these temporary labor migration programs, and they carry that vulnerability and they carry that dislocation with them through their migration. From a human rights perspective, I really hope that researchers will start to look more deeply into some of the ways in which we accept in our region people move for these labor migration outcomes, where the right to housing or health are entirely delegated to the employers, for instance, as we've seen in the COVID-19 pandemic, or where the right to family life is entirely denied to people that are unable to bring their family with them for long periods of time. So I think that there's lots of kind of very important questions that researchers need to ask as well when they look at these programs. just very quickly, and Reina will be able to answer this much better, but I did want to say that in relation to your question, Carl, I think that national human rights institutions have an opportunity to model what human rights means for the discussion of climate change. So they have an opportunity to bring affected communities into the conversation to say this is what participation and empowerment looks like. I do also, and this is where the example of the Philippine National Human Rights Commission is so kind of inspiring, is that you can empower what accountability looks like. And Reina will tell us more about the experience of the Philippines in that. But it is also about bringing the voice of the people into litigation and into the jurisprudence and remedy kind of system of countries.
Thank you so much. I'll just add one thought of my own on migrationist adaptation, which my sense is that when it's overemphasized that it's just people's agency to respond, it actually reduces the pressure of the state to fulfill their own duties. And I think that one of the strengths, at least from my perspective of the book that's been written, is that it really focuses on the duties of state towards people that have been displaced. So hopefully that will also contribute somewhat to redressing this balance of migrationist adaptation as always being a solution. So let's move to the Philippines, I think, to hear some of the experiences that you've had there.
Thank you, and thank you to Dr. Abere for introducing what the Commission has been doing in relation to climate change. So we already have this national inquiry on climate change, which the Commission spearheaded, I think, around 2016. So this inquiry is a process for us to gather the information and the experiences of people who are directly affected by these disasters caused by, particularly by the changing of the climate. So we brought them to a venue wherein the government officials, for example, can be accountable, can be held accountable to these communities, but at the same time, we elevate it to an international level, making the connection that what people are experiencing now is rooted in a global concern, that the actions of, for example, of these, what we call the carbon majors, have an impact on the human rights and the enjoyment of those human rights of people who are living in coastal areas, of those whose livelihood and lives were threatened because of, for example, super typhoons or storm surges. So these are real life experiences that we are now surfacing, putting it into the jurisprudence, having different legal entities providing their support or their thoughts on the process, and hopefully this becomes a global exercise that other NHRIs can adapt, or also other entities can adapt and come up with this framework that the climate change, it's a global thing and it has impacts on people who are living particularly in areas wherein they are at most vulnerable. So I think that's one of the best aspects of the climate change inquiry that the Commission has conducted. Okay, thank you.
It feels like we've lost the room. Are people in Bangkok still with us? I can't see Carl.
Think so.
Hey. We're back with you. Okay. But I can't hear you. Okay. I think I can address the question about NHRIs and make a final point. I'm still hearing myself echo. A couple of points on the NHRI question. I think we're really fortunate to have the representative from the Human Rights Commission of the Philippines, who's already spoken. I'm not sure if there was also some monitoring work done by the Human Rights Commission in relation to the Taal volcano eruption earlier this year. That's something that we've seen in some other places as well. In the aftermath of the 2015 earthquakes in Nepal, the Nepalese Human Rights Commission undertook monitoring of the response aspect in the days and weeks following the first earthquakes. And that provided a really good illustration of a human rights-based approach, and can be used, to go back a bit to Erin's question, can be used to highlight challenges that need to be addressed by duty bearers, whether that's emergency response personnel, or looking more towards the future and building back better what needs to be done to avoid the risk of displacement and other forms of disaster-related harm. I can also mention that the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons came out with a report in 2019 on the role of national human rights institutions in relation to internal displacement. And building on that work, something that the Raoul Wallenberg Institute has contributed to in Africa, which last year the African Union declared as the Year of Refugees, Returnees and IDPs. We contributed to the development of an action plan for, together with the network of African national human rights institutions, to address, from a human rights perspective, displacement in the context of disasters and climate change. So that work is getting underway slowly but surely. The other thing I want to mention about NHRIs and the monitoring aspect and the jurisprudence aspect, this kind of goes a little bit to what Tasneem was talking about in terms of the fears that states might have. What happens if we adopt a human rights-based approach? We're going to get hit by the NHRI and they're going to say you're not doing what you're supposed to. The reality, first of all, is that that will happen whether or not you adopt a human rights-based approach. The role of the NHRI is to examine the way the state is addressing questions relating to the protection, respect for, and fulfillment of human rights for all persons within the jurisdiction of the state. So whether there's a national strategy on the management of disaster and climate-induced internal displacement or not, the same questions will be asked. It's simply helping states to fulfill those obligations if they do have a policy framework in place, because it helps to take those steps that are important to take. But it's also important to stress that it's absolutely not only about that monitoring and accountability aspect, but what we're developing, particularly with the consortium that I mentioned earlier, are effective toolkits for actors at the local level, as well as at the provincial and national level, to integrate these principles into policies and standard operating procedures, so that there's a really practical toolkit aspect to this human rights-based approach that is a matter of making these basic principles accessible and capable of being implemented in a diverse range of contexts. The final point I want to make relates to something that Carl said. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it made me think about this point, which really infuses the approach we took to the research, which is the idea that disasters are not natural. And this resonates really clearly with a human rights-based approach, because it recognizes that hazards like cyclones or floods or sea level rise are part of the equation, but we see disasters unfolding in situations where people are living in conditions of exposure and vulnerability. And that's a human rights question. Why are people living in exposed areas? Why are there conditions of existence that predispose certain people to the kinds of harm that we associate with disasters and climate change? And that's what we need to be looking at moving forward. And that's also something I want to just close by saying that the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction is now taking on board quite expressly, and actually has an information campaign about that. So it's all about governance. That's it. Thank you.
I guess within the social sciences we teach on our program, we try and question whenever you hear the word natural, you have to question what's natural about it, because there's often underpinning human causes behind, and especially things like natural disasters are often the product of past policy decisions that have produced vulnerability in the process. Which is, I mean, maybe it was related to the question that I was asking about the challenges for national human rights institutions to not just address migration or internal displacement alone, but some of the other policies that create vulnerability that in turn create vulnerability specifically for those that are displaced. Albert, do you have a final comment? And then I will turn it over for the closing remarks.
Thanks, Carl. Just a quick point. One of the important findings in the edited volume is that a lot of the states have signed up to a number of humanitarian, human rights, DRR, international frameworks. And they are reflected at the policies at the national level. But when you actually get to the local level, that's where the problem is, because there's no implementation. So in all the cases that we have seen, the problems that were highlighted is due to the lack of implementations of all those principles, guidance, treaties that the states have signed up to. They know what they're committed to, but they're not really implementing them on the ground. Or if they implemented, they were not following the standards. So I think this is the important role for the NHRI to actually, was what Matthew said, aside from monitoring, but holding the state responsible for their commitments.
Thank you so much. So I need to invite Victor to the microphone. But before I do that, I would like to, I don't think I can summarize the discussion, but I just want to give my sort of personal sense of the importance of the discussion that's been had. As Matthew, actually, as the opening remarks, and then Matthew emphasized as well, when we started our discussion, we highlighted the impact of climate change and disaster on internally displaced people and migration is a really key issue, especially in Asia. And the impacts have not been documented enough until now. But I think beyond just documenting these are the challenges, my sense of this discussion is both that there are already opportunities and solutions that are being pushed forward, but also that maybe more the conceptual approach that's being developed by bringing together like the insights from the way that we understand sustainable development and environmental change on the one hand, with a human rights-based approach is really important, and that work is being done, and then it's being in turn promoted into policy, and in some places already being enacted into policy and strategies. So it also gives hope that there's a way forward. So I would like to thank the three panelists, Pia, Rainer, and Tasneem, as well as Albert and Matthew from the previous panel for the contributions and for sharing so much with the wider group today. And maybe I can ask everyone to give them a round of applause. And okay.
Dr. Tasneem, Ms. Rena, Dr. Pierre, Dr. Irene, Dr. Matthew, and Dr. Albert. Thank you very much. So please give a big round of applause to yourself again, please. Since we have been like 15 people in this room, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have come to the end of this afternoon lunch. So I hope that you found this session and presentation informative, so provoking and useful. I would like to thank both our in-room audience and also our virtual or online audience for joining us today. And top of all, I would like you all to give a big round of applause to the man who stands behind our events today, Mr. Victor Bernard. If anyone wants to know more about the reports, you can go to our websites and download and read it for today. Thank you very much. Until we meet again, let's save the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you to the political scientist of my discipline. I was very happy to see a political scientist.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Bye.